Hollywood likes to pretend that every film gets a fair chance, but buried beneath decades of red carpet glamour is a quieter truth. Some horror films weren't just overlooked, they were silenced. Imagine entire productions poured into a movie, months of shooting, prosthetics crafted by hand, actors giving everything they have, and then, right before the world ever sees it, the studio steps in, not to promote it, but to smother it. Budgets vanish, marketing is withdrawn, release dates shift without warning, and the film is pushed into the shadows like an inconvenient secret. Directors whisper that their work was sabotaged intentionally. Producers recall meetings where executives dismissed their films with a single sentence. Some even believe their projects revealed themes too controversial, too uncompromising, or simply too unprofitable for the people in charge to tolerate. Hollywood has many ways to bury a film without ever touching a frame of it. A canceled advertising campaign here, a dead-end release slot there, or a quiet decision to limit screenings so severely that no audience could ever discover the movie's potential. Tonight, we uncover 15 horror films that were never meant to thrive, titles that were completed, ready, waiting, and then quietly sealed away by the very studios that created them. Shall we begin? Fact 1. The Ninth Configuration, 1980. William Peter Blatty delivered a film unlike anything the studio expected, philosophical, surreal, darkly humorous, and spiritually unsettling. The Ninth Configuration defied easy marketing labels, and that alone made executives nervous. Instead of trusting the film's uniqueness, they retreated. The studio slashed advertising almost entirely. Early promotional commitments evaporated, trade ads were canceled, and distribution deals were minimized. Some major cities never screened the film, while others featured only brief, unpublicized runs. Blatty later revealed he believed the studio was embarrassed by the film's complexity, afraid audiences wouldn't understand it, and unwilling to risk defending it. What should have been a bold, challenging contribution to horror cinema was instead released like an obligation the studio wanted to fulfill quietly and forget quickly. Its brilliance survived, but only because audiences eventually found what the studio tried to hide. Fact 2. Session 9, 2001. When Session 9 completed production, the studio found itself holding a film that didn't fit neatly into any conventional category. It wasn't a slasher. It wasn't a monster movie. It was a slow, psychological descent into paranoia, filmed in a real abandoned asylum whose atmosphere seeped into every frame. Executives panicked. They believed mainstream audiences wouldn't understand it, and rather than risk a wider release, they shrank the film's presence to a whisper. Promotional campaigns were cut almost entirely, posters were limited, trailers never reached major networks, and screenings were confined to a handful of art house theaters where it quietly slipped in and out without notice. Some insiders later admitted the studio didn't want Session 9 overshadowing other horror titles they were pushing that year, so the film was quietly sidelined, given no chance to reach the audience that would have embraced it. Only years later, through word of mouth and home video, did viewers realize the studio had buried one of the most chilling psychological horrors of its era. Fact 3. The Keep, 1983. What Michael Mann envisioned for The Keep was a sweeping supernatural epic part war story, part metaphysical nightmare. What the studio wanted, however, was something shorter, cheaper, and easier to market. When production ran over budget and creative disagreements escalated, executives seized their opportunity to take control. The studio's solution was ruthless. They carved Mann's sprawling narrative down to a fragmented shell, removing essential storylines and character arcs. The resulting 96-minute cut felt disjointed, a ghost of the film it was meant to be. Instead of supporting the new version, the studio treated it as damaged goods. The marketing rollout was minimal, trailers were sparse, and theatrical placement was weak. Critics couldn't understand what the movie was trying to be, and audiences barely knew it existed. Many who worked on the project insisted that it wasn't the film that failed, it was the studio's deliberate decision to cripple it. To this day, fans still search for Mann's lost cut, a version buried far more thoroughly than any evil lurking in the on-screen fortress. Fact 4. Curtains, 1983. The production of Curtains was turbulent enough, but the studio's handling of the finished film sealed its fate. After conflicts between the original director and producers led to extensive reshoots, the studio seemed eager to distance itself from the project. The fractured narrative became the perfect excuse to reduce their involvement. Though the film contained some of the most striking imagery in Canadian horror, the ice skating killer, the unsettling masks, the studio released it with barely a flicker of support. Posters were inconsistently distributed, theatrical dates shifted repeatedly, and some territories never received the film at all. Actors later recounted they were never invited to a premiere, nor informed properly of the release. The studio's message was unmistakable. Curtains was a film they wanted forgotten, yet its haunting visuals refused to stay buried. Long after the studio tried to erase it, the film resurfaced through cult appreciation, proving that even intentional sabotage can't fully suppress a compelling nightmare. Fact 5. The Sentinel, 1977. When studio executives saw the final cut of The Sentinel, they saw more than a supernatural thriller. They saw a public relations nightmare waiting to happen. Its brazen religious imagery, disturbing practical effects, and willingness to delve into theological horror unnerved them. Instead of capitalizing on its boldness, they panicked. Despite a strong cast and striking visuals, the studio scaled back advertising drastically. Planned magazine spreads vanished before publication. International distributors complained that they received almost no marketing assets, forcing them to improvise with low-quality, generic horror artwork. The U.S. release was sabotaged further when the film was positioned directly against high-profile competitors, virtually guaranteeing it would be overshadowed. Cast and crew believed the film was intentionally sidelined to avoid backlash. Whether out of fear or indifference, the studio allowed The Sentinel to drift into obscurity. A victim of corporate caution, it deserved a fair fight. Instead, it was quietly pushed off the battlefield. Fact 6. Dead and Buried, 1981. Dead and Buried had the makings of a sleeper success, a moody seaside town, eerie atmosphere, and grisly effects from some of the best practical artists of the era. Early reactions were strong, too strong, some suggested. Executives reportedly worried the film's graphic imagery and grim tone clashed with the studio's public image, especially at a time when horror was drawing political scrutiny. Rather than risk stirring controversy, the studio stepped back. Marketing plans were scaled down abruptly, with promotional materials sent late or inconsistently. Several regional distributors admitted they were told not to push the title, leaving it stranded with limited screenings and almost no visibility. The film's haunting visuals deserved attention, yet the studio treated it as something to be quietly contained. By the time audiences finally discovered it years later on home video, Dead and Buried already carried the unmistakable scent of a film that had been deliberately underexposed, not mishandled, managed into silence. Fact 7. The Sender, 1982. From the moment The Sender screened for critics, they recognized it as something rare, a psychological horror film with dreamlike intensity and emotional depth. But the studio didn't want rare, they wanted profitable. And executives convinced themselves audiences wouldn't understand a slow-burn nightmare about trauma and psychic visions. Instead of leaning into its strengths, the studio cut the marketing budget to scraps. Plans for trailers and TV spots evaporated. The film received a release so limited that many regions never even had the option to screen it. Posters arrived late or not at all. Interview requests were ignored. Insiders later admitted the studio deliberately avoided promoting the movie because it competed tonally with another project they hoped to push. The Sender simply didn't fit the commercial narrative they were building that year. What could have been a defining psychological horror film of the early 80s was instead relegated to near invisibility. Only time and dedicated fans would reveal the brilliance the studio tried so hard to hide. Fact 8. The Boogeyman, 1980. The Boogeyman had the potential to capitalize on the supernatural boom of the early 80s until controversy struck. Early reviews accused it of being too violent, too disturbing, and too morally vague. Instead of defending their release, the studio recoiled, terrified of inviting pressure from moral watchdog groups. What followed was a release sabotaged through silence. Newspaper ads were canceled in multiple regions. Theater owners reported receiving instructions to keep the film low profile, and some were even advised to avoid putting its name on marquees. Marketing materials that had already been printed were quietly discarded. The few audiences who managed to see the film encountered a work strange enough to be memorable, yet nowhere near as scandalous as the studio seemed to fear. But the damage had been done. The film wasn't pulled from release. It was allowed to fade, intentionally. Only over decades did its cult reputation form, slowly resurrecting what the studio once tried to bury. Fact 9. The Outing, 1987. The Outing, later retitled The Lamp without the director's input, became a victim of quiet studio abandonment the moment executives realized they had no faith in its box office chances. What began as a supernatural thriller with a unique setting and an ambitious creature concept was quickly pushed to the sidelines once the studio prioritized another mystical horror feature on its slate. The name change alone fractured all early buzz. Marketing departments were confused about which title to promote. Some theater chains received posters with the wrong artwork, others received nothing at all. Scheduled ads vanished, local promotions were pulled, and release dates shifted just enough to ensure the film never found stable ground. When The Outing finally reached theaters, it materialized only in scattered, low-traffic venues, no interviews, no press screenings, no clarity, just a film tossed into the darkness, left for audiences to discover or, more accurately, to miss entirely. Years later, horror fans would stumble across the film on VHS and wonder how something so odd and atmospheric slipped through the cracks. The truth is simple: it was pushed. Fact 10. Spookies, 1986. Few productions were sabotaged as blatantly as Spookies. After the original directors completed their edit, the studio decided they wanted something different, something they could control completely. Their solution was brutal. They fired the directing team and ordered new scenes to be shot by others, scenes that bore no narrative connection to the film's existing story. The movie was torn apart and stitched back together into a strange, disjointed hybrid. Instead of investing in a proper marketing push, the studio released the film with minimal support, hoping the oddity of its monsters would sell the movie on its own. But audiences were confused, critics were baffled, and the theatrical release evaporated almost immediately. Those who worked on the original cut insisted the sabotage was deliberate, driven by ego, anger, and the desire to assert control rather than preserve artistry. The final film that reached theaters wasn't a creative failure. It was the aftermath of a takeover. Fact 11. The Being, 1983. The Being should have thrived in the era of slime-covered monsters and late-night creature features. Instead, the studio treated it like an embarrassment. The film's eccentric tone, bizarre humor, and unapologetic practical effects made executives uneasy. They feared audiences would laugh at the wrong moments, or worse, at the studio itself. So, the movie was quietly shuffled into midnight slots and rundown venues, better suited for forgotten grindhouse titles. The marketing budget was cut to the bone, regional distributors were discouraged from giving it premium slots, and promotional materials were delivered inconsistently or not at all. Cast and crew later recalled how helpless they felt watching the release collapse around them. The movie wasn't given a chance to succeed, not even a small one. Yet, like many films deliberately pushed aside, The Being found fans years later, long after the studio had tried to erase it. Fact 12. The Initiation, 1984. On paper, The Initiation had everything a mid-80-second slasher needed: a sorority setting, a rising young star, and a twist that early viewers found surprisingly effective. But just when momentum began to build, the studio redirected its attention elsewhere. A competing project, one they believed could generate higher profits, took priority, and The Initiation quietly slipped onto the expendable list. Marketing plans were cut off midstream, posters were printed but never shipped, publicity teams stopped pitching interviews, even radio spots scheduled for release week were abruptly canceled. The film wasn't delayed, it was abandoned in plain sight. When it finally reached theaters, its presence was ghost-like: scattered showtimes, inconsistent promotion, and almost no effort to help audiences find it. By the time word of mouth began to form, the studio had already moved on. Its failure wasn't a surprise to insiders, it was the outcome of a choice. Fact 13. The House Where Evil Dwells, 1982. This supernatural tale, steeped in Japanese folklore, should have stood out as something rare and atmospheric. But internal disputes over ownership and distribution rights doomed it before audiences ever had a chance to see it. Executives labeled the film a problem title, a phrase that often signals a project destined for quiet disposal. Marketing materials were produced and then abruptly halted. The theatrical release was so thinly spread that even horror fans in major cities reported never seeing it listed. Its brief presence in theaters felt intentional, a controlled, measured appearance designed to fulfill contractual obligations while ensuring minimal exposure. Many who later discovered the film on home video wondered how such a distinctive ghost story could vanish so quickly. The answer was simple: the studio decided it wasn't worth the trouble to let it live. Fact 14. The Nesting 1981. From the moment The Nesting entered post-production, tension between its director and the producers poisoned its chances of survival. After disagreements over tone and final cut, the studio quietly withdrew its support. What followed was not an official cancellation, but something colder. The film was technically released, yet the studio made sure almost no one knew. Advertising commitments were pulled without explanation. Scheduled magazine features disappeared. Distributors were told the film was low priority, which in industry language often means don't bother. When The Nesting finally reached theaters, it did so without press screenings, interviews, or even basic promotional placement. Some cities received no posters at all. Others only showed the film for a single week. To those who worked on it, the message was unmistakable. The film wasn't merely ignored, it was punished. Fact 15. The Kindred, 1987. When The Kindred wrapped production, those involved believed they had crafted something uniquely grotesque and unforgettable. But instead of embracing its monstrous creativity, the studio treated the film like a mistake that needed to be hidden. In the weeks before release, promotional materials were abruptly halted. Trailers that were scheduled to air vanished from programming, posters intended for theater lobbies never arrived, and the film slipped onto screens with barely a whisper. Some crew members later suggested the studio feared the creature effects were too strange, too unpredictable to market safely. Others believed the sabotage was strategic, that a competing film on the same slate needed every 12. Advantage and burying. The Kindred ensured its failure. The movie arrived in a tiny handful of theaters, relegated to obscure times, giving audiences almost no chance to discover it. What could have become a celebrated cult classic was instead left to suffocate in obscurity. Its downfall wasn't natural, it was engineered. Bonus: Grizzly 2, The Concert, 1983, released 2020. Few films illustrate the idea of being buried alive by a studio as chillingly as Grizzly 2. What began as an ambitious follow-up to the 1976 hit quickly spiraled into one of Hollywood's strangest disappearances. Filming was well underway, the cast was locked, and an enormous outdoor concert set had already been built when everything suddenly collapsed. Financing evaporated almost overnight. Key producers vanished, leaving cast and crew stranded with no guidance and no resources. Studio representatives arrived not with solutions, but with padlocks shutting down the entire production without a single warning. What footage existed was seized, boxed up, and shuffled into a bureaucratic maze of conflicting ownership claims. For decades, the film lived only as a rumor. Horror fans speculated about the lost Grizzly sequel, and crew members recounted stories of chaos and unfinished scenes. Not even the involvement of then unknowns like George Clooney and Charlie Sheen could convince the studio to resurrect it. Then, nearly 40 years later, fragments of the footage resurfaced. A version patched together from incomplete reels and missing scenes finally saw release. It wasn't the film that was meant to be, but the film that escaped its grave. Grizzly 2 didn't just fail to reach theaters, it was intentionally sealed away. A cinematic corpse the studio hoped would never claw back into the light. If these buried films taught us anything tonight, it's that not every horror story happens on screen. Some of the darkest ones unfold behind locked studio doors, quiet decisions, vanished budgets, and movies erased before they ever had a chance. If you want to keep uncovering the secrets Hollywood tried to hide, stay close, follow the night shriek, and step deeper into the vault where forgotten films still whisper. There are many more shadows waiting.